welcome to everyone who's here in person and who's joining us remotely. My name is Eugene Reichel. I'm the director of the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies, and want to welcome you to the third annual CEERES Directors Lecture. Today's event is sponsored by CEERES with generous support from the U.S. Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center grants. For those watching online, I wanted to just say that there'll be time for questions at the end of today's program, and wanted to encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can enter a question at any time before or during the discussion. So today, I'm very pleased to introduce Kate Brown, who is Thomas M. Siebel Distinguished Professor in the History of Science at MIT. She is author of a number of books, including a biography of no place from ethnic borderland to Soviet heartland, published in 2004, Plutopia, Nuclear Families in Atomic Cities and the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters, published in 2013, and her latest book, Manual for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future, published in 2019, has been translated into 9 languages, and was a finalist for the 2019 National Books Critics Circle Award. Welcome.
So, thanks for having me. Thanks for showing up with all the things. One reason why I should do it. I want to talk today about the Chernobyl accident and how we frame it, and then how, in doing research on this topic, I came to think the way I approach my sort of different ways. I kind of feel like this book that came out. I think when I was first supposed to come here. First, let me talk about the accident in April 26, 1986. Chernobyl reactor number 4 in Soviet Ukraine exploded, and then it exploded again, and it was about 50 to 200 million during the 3 years. And this was an awful lot of destructive energy. Within 36 hours, the Soviet government had cordoned off zone of nation, and in the next couple of weeks, they removed, evacuated towns and cities. 120,000 people were you hear a lot of dramatic stories about the accident. Series years ago, centered on the masculine high drama. But when I started researching this in 2014, that there's so many uncertainties. There's very little that we can say for sure. And so for instance, how many people died? So I did what historians normally do. I went into the archive, I tried to do it. And I asked the archivist, I had worked with them before, can I have the files, medical files? They looked at me, that was, okay, you just count it. You're not going to I think, oh, Mom, let's just keep it going. And it didn't take a great sleuth. In about 4 or 5 minutes, we found full document collection labeled in plain English, the medical consequences of Chernobyl. And I looked at these archivists, and I realized they were trying to deceive me. It's just that nobody had come in and pulled those documents. And for archivists, unless the historians pulled them, those documents. I could tell as I signed up about things the first time, usually this amount. I also realized, as I sat down, that I was and so I started working my way through them, and these articles were full of things that were, to me, were very different. And defied the classic notions that this narrative that's designed by leaders. For instance, Moscow leaders said that radioactivity was safely contained within the zone of contamination. But what I found is that about 3 days after the accident, a storm front was blowing northeast towards some of the big Russian cities, including Moscow. So they sent up pilots to receive the clouds, and they let radioactive rain fall on rural roofs in order to save. And you can see from the map here, this is the map of Belarus. There it goes. Down here is where the plant is, right? Ukraine. These are angry militaries here are here to fallout and in the zone of nation. The pilots held back while they went over to the city of Gomel, and here in the Mogilov Oblast. And you see these spots, angry red spots, as radioactive as right zero. Now this was a triage population. Maybe it was okay. 200,000 people lived in that area there, what I call the second Chernobyl zone, and millions of people lived in it. The only problem, they didn't tell anyone. Not even when they were covered. So until 1999, this area was not.
Can we just ask you, stop, we're having some trouble with the Zoom audio.
Mm-hmm.
People are having a hard time hearing. I'm wondering if we could try and move your lapel mic up a little bit.
Is that better?
Let me see. Can people, if people could let us know if they can hear a little better?
Thank you. I'll speak up.
Okay.
You have a thumbs up on that? Is that better?
I can't hear anything yet.
Go ahead, go.
You can let us know in the chat if you can hear a little better. We can hear it through the headphones here, so we're having a hard time diagnosing the problem, but we've gotten it better. So I'm good, and let me know in the chat if you still can't hear Kate, and I will take the microphone that seems to be working very well up to you.
Okay, great. Another narrative is that leaders in Moscow said that they tested the food and they found the food safe. So I started working my way through the Ministry of Agriculture records. And what I found were vectors of contaminated food spreading, especially where people congregate. There was about 100,000 head of cattle that were right under some cloud fallout. They started to get sick. Some beef packers went in. They slaughtered all those animals. And then the question was what to do with carcasses. In the Soviet Union at this time, meat was a really dear product. So they hated to just throw it out. So what I found in the archives was a manual for the meat packer that says, and this is why I call this book a manual for survival, is that over and over again I found special new manuals for people to deal with this very novel situation in human history, how to live in a post-nuclear landscape. So there's manuals for doctors, manuals for school teachers, manuals for dairy farmers, manuals for meat packers, etc. So the manual for meat packers said, take the meat and measure it and grade it, low, medium, and high levels of radiation. You like?
Just, you don't have to say anything about it. It's gonna.
Grade means low, medium, high levels of radiation. The low and medium levels take, mix it with clean meat, and make sausage. And then package it as you normally would and send it all over the Soviet Union, except the manual says very clearly, don't send it to Moscow. You probably know where the people who wrote the manual live. High level meat, take the high level meat and shove it in a freezer and wait for it to decay. Pretty soon out of Gomel, they're saying, we need more freezers. They keep asking, more freezers, more freezers. They don't evidently get enough freezers because they find a refrigerated train car and they shove in 60 tons of radioactive meat and they send it to Baku, where the counters go off. Baku sends it to Yerevan. Same thing. For 4 years, this radioactive ghost train circulated around the western half of the Soviet Union before the KGB finally buried it as radioactive waste with the cracked up train inside the Chernobyl zone. Probably where it should have gone to. I could see from the typical map of radiation exposure that this map made no sense in terms of human exposure, of health problems. I can see hotspots of health problems occurred outside of these areas with the red spots. For instance, here in this town of Chernobyl, I found a document that said that there are 200 women who got liquidator status, who worked in a wool factory. Now, liquidators were people who got special subsidies and special compensation for having work to put out to deal with the accident, and they've gotten documented exposures. I usually think of firemen rushing at radioactive flames as liquidators, not women 50 miles away in relatively clean town who were textile workers. So I kept looking around, how did these women get this exposure? I found some things in the archive, but finally just drove up there. And I first talked to the management. And they said, yeah, we had a problem in 1986. And we brought a commissioner from Moscow. And we changed our process. And no problem. Wool got clean. Crisis over. Well, I was, that's the management story. So I asked if I could go down the line, and I did. And I met 10 of the 200 women on my list. And they picked their names out of the list, and I said, where is everybody else? They said, oh, well, they either died or they've been invalided out of pension. Now, what were these women doing to get such a dose? They'd been picking up all day long dirty bales of wool that measured 3.2 refuted an hour. That's like picking up an X-ray machine while it's turned on. Now, these women, they were really interesting. They had no more than a high school degree, if that. But they knew a lot about radiation and how it worked. They pointed to different parts of their bodies that were diseased or aged, and they knew which radioactive isotopes lodged accurately in which organ. And they asked me, they're like, sure, we get the wool clean, but what about the wastewater leaving the plant? Did you ask the management about that? I said, no, I didn't. I said, where did it go? And they said, we went into the drinking reservoir for the town. I didn't believe that story, but I went to the town records, and sure enough, they were right. Another story. Officially, Moscow leaders said they gave medical exams to 900,000 people, and they found no change in health. They also said that they hospitalized 300 emergency first responders for exposures to Chernobyl. I found, working through the Ministry of Health records in Belarus and Ukraine, not 300 people hospitalized, but 40,000 hospitalized in the summer after the accident for Chernobyl exposures, 11,000 of whom were children. Records show that immediately after the accident, doctors treated sick children and sick adults. They recorded an increase in thyroid problems, complications of birth, birth defects, and infant mortality. In 1987, in contaminated regions, perinatal deaths within 10 days of birth, doubled in 1987 and tripled in 1988. In one county, for instance, of 103 pregnancies, 61 turned out to be mine. Among adults, cases of heart disease, enlarged thyroids, gastrointestinal and urinary tract disorders, cataracts, liver, and blood disease doubled and tripled from 1988 to 89 to 90. Cancer rates climbed 10 times higher per capita in that southern Mogila, second Chernobyl zone, than in the rest of Belarus as a whole. And these are two people who are post-op from thyroid cancer surgery. You can see the boy here has not just thyroid cancer problems, but some growth hormone conditions related to endocrine disorders. And these are the kind of documents that I looked at. This document says that in one county of 1,551 kids, of them, 1,132 had one chronic disease or more. Now, this is a flip. Before 1986, the Soviets had a category called healthy. 90% of kids in a county would be healthy. And that changes after 1986. 80 to 90%, one chronic disease. Pernicious anemia was one of them. In this chart in Belarus, arrows and vinegar. The simple questions of fatalities were difficult to answer. The UN website gave the number of 33 to 54 people dead from Chernobyl exposures. Greenpeace projected 90,000 people dead. I noticed over time, Washington Post tended to cite those lower numbers. But I also realized that in Ukraine alone, 35,000 women received compensation because their husbands died from Chernobyl exposure. Now that's a very circumscribed number because it just includes men who were married with documented exposure. So women or children or younger children included in that. We looked and looked and looked, and then off the record in 2016, at the 30th anniversary, Ukrainian officials told me that they estimated about 150,000 dead in just. Now, Ukraine only got 20% of Chernobyl exposures. The rest went to Belarus and Western Russia. Those countries have released no numbers about the public health effects. Could not reload timeline and budget. So I worked to sort this confusing record. Who was right? Was there really a public health disaster of this magnitude that somehow flew beneath the radar? The textual records revealed many contradictions and conflicting measurements, plus some strange occurrences. In the Soviet Union, the summer of 1990, when the first UN scientific consultants were coming in to assess the disaster, 4 computers and with their accompanying hard drives went missing, and those are the only 4 computers in the Soviet Union that had dose measurements of Chernobyl survivors. We still never found the program. I found in the archives that Soviet officials falsified accounts, while KGB agents planted fake news in the newspapers. I also noted that consultants for UN agencies disappeared evidence and dismissed about half of the research that came from Ukraine and Belarus on health effects. And I was doing this, in 2016, I was thinking of the WikiLeaks scandal and the elections. And I thought, what if this information I made in the archives was planted there for me to find later? How do I cross-check this story? Now that I know that, I know that people lie, therefore archives lie. So I wondered, I thought, well, maybe trees don't lie. Maybe I should go out and look at landscapes and look at these ecologies and see if I can find evidence there. One thing to know, and that's what I started to do, and one thing to know about the Chernobyl accident is that it occurred right in the midst of Europe's largest swamp, the Plutopia marshes. And this is an amazingly beautiful ecological biome. It's got a sandy bowl of land transected by 17 rivers that break up into hundreds of lakes and streams. In the 1960s, Soviet hydrologists came in and they started digging canals and drying up large portions of the swamp for agriculture and for what was projected to be Europe's largest nuclear power. Nuclear power plants need a lot of water. There was one area, I wanted a baseline. What was the swamp like before all these cumulative measures? And so there was one area called the Omani swamp that was still in its normal, completely cleaned up state. And so I asked the forester to give me a tour of this area. Now, the reason why this area wasn't dried up was because it was turned into an Air Force bombing range. And so we're going around, we're looking at spent ordnance and the towers that the generals watched like fast. And there were about 10 villages in there that they resettled before they started bombing. We went to some of the old village sites, stand around the cemetery, and I noticed this pine tree growing out of a bomb crater. And I take a closer look at the pine tree, and I noticed these strange morphological changes. Pine needles are all supposed to go in the same direction. They all get the same order. They're also still like this, and they don't like that. These pine needles are going in different directions. The biologists would call them disorganized. And then you see that curled one. That's not supposed to happen either. So there's mutations here. And a lot of things can cause mutation, or a few things can cause mutations in pine trees. But radiation's a pretty good candidate. So I asked the forester, how old do you think this tree is? 50, 60 years. I said, well, that's from before Chernobyl. We looked around and we didn't see any other pine trees growing out of the bomb crater, and we didn't see any other pine trees. Now, I filed this picture in a folder I had about unverified accounts of the Soviets testing small strategic in that bombing range. And I didn't have verification of it because that record is in Moscow off limits to researchers, and that's the nature of power. You can make stories go away from being. But I had some other evidence. This was a map that was made by Soviet specialists in nuclear emergencies in the 1960s. For 4 years, they toured around the Pripyat marshes, measured water, soils, plants, and human bodies in the along the swamp. And they were looking for radioactive cesium, and they found in the bodies of villagers 10 to 30 times higher rates of radioactive cesium than in the bodies of people in Minsk and Kiev. Now, in the censored publication that came out in 1974, they said this radiation was from global fallout from American bombs of radioactivity. But what I find is so strange is this looks like a Chernobyl map of the same swamp, but made 5 years before they even broke ground for the Chernobyl plant. And with that, I started to think that, radiation in this part of the world long predated Chernobyl. And I started to think, maybe we should think about this in a different way. Maybe Chernobyl isn't an accident. Maybe it's a point of acceleration on a timeline of exposures that started in 1945 and continued much longer. And the reason I think that's important, to not think of it only as an accident, is that an accident has a beginning, a middle, and a definite end. Where if you think of it as an acceleration on a timeline, then we're talking about an event that is ongoing and in flux, and is actually on the move while I'm trying to write about it, which I found made Chernobyl kind of a slippery subject. I see that we don't have any more sound.
We're good.
And what do I mean by a slippery subject? Think of time, for instance. Physicists have been saying for over 100 years that time, as it's measured in minutes and then up to years and decades, is a human construct. That time actually expands and contracts in unpredictable ways. And Chernobyl landscape sort of proved that to be true. People and animals experienced a rapid radiation aging where the organs of a 30-year-old start to present as those of a 75-year-old. For them, time sped up. On the other end of the spectrum, the red forest in the Chernobyl zone took the hardest hit of radiation, and these pine trees turned red and died. And foresters came in and they mowed them down, 1986. This photograph was taken 25 years later. These trees should have turned to dust, but they're still sitting there because there aren't enough microbes and insects to do the work of decomposition. If Rumpelstiltskin had fallen asleep in the red forest and woken up 25 years later, he would have known how much time had passed. Time slowed down, almost stopped in this part of Chernobyl. Now, as an historian, I've always wanted to freeze frame the past so I could write about it, but this was a chilling realization for me. The final place. Sorry. So these problems of time, and I had other problems of scale too that I'll talk about later, led me to continue to search for ways other than texts and numbers to try to understand the Chernobyl experiments. And so I called up 2 biologists, the only 2 that I could find who regularly visit the zone twice a year. They've been doing this since 1999, Tim Musso and Anders Moeller. And they were kind enough to invite me along on their twice annual trips as a participant of some. And you hear a lot about the Chernobyl zone in newspapers. Every year we hear the story that nature is hiding from Chernobyl. And editors love that story. It's a very seductive story. It means humans, they mess up territories, and then nature just fixes it and walk away nature. A lot of editors ask their photojournalists to go get this story. They often can't find the wildlife that they're supposed to get. But don't worry, in Chernobyl, there's some cage. Get the shot and go home. But when I followed the biologist, what I learned is that it's a much more complicated story than the nature of science. that radiation differs by 4 orders of magnitude throughout the Chernobyl zone. It's a very patchy. And in areas where there's medium to high levels of radiation, they start to see damage extensively. For instance, they find that there aren't many pollinators. And when there's not many pollinators, there aren't many frugivores. Birds that eat fruit. Without frugivores, there's no one to spread the seeds. And so they found in these hotter areas of the zone, all of 3 fruit trees seeded after them. What they're describing is a cascade of extinction. Every rock we turn over, we start to find damage. We were traveling in, I think it was 2017, and I woke up one morning and said, we're going to go to the Red Forest. And I had hoped to avoid going to the Red Forest because radiation there is between 50 and 100 microsieverts an hour. And that was higher than I was comfortable with, but I had made this promise that I was going to go, so off we went. And it's not a pretty forest. This is a tree that was planted commercially as lumber. Supposed to grow board straight, and you can see the trees again. These trees were trying to be trees, but they only managed to be shrubs. And you see the ground covers. It should be a lush Ukrainian forest. You see that brown, burned out ground cover. But the thing that really bothered me most is that my Geiger counter was screeching. And Tim told me, turn that thing off. And I said, well, why is it not at 100, but at 994 microsieverts an hour? And Tim said, oh yeah, 8 months ago we had a forest fire. And it took all the radiation that was stored in the leaf litter and it volatilized it into smoke and ash, and that's you're still in that. When we got out of the zone, I checked the newspapers, no coverage of this event. The IEA, which scales nuclear disasters, did not scale it. It would have been a pretty major nuclear event. It would have registered at least a 2 or 3 on their scale, but it somehow got missed in the radar. And I think that tells us something about the time scales of these long-lived radioactive isotopes, similar to that of long-lived chemical toxins, as they stretch beyond the capacity of human attention. For us to pay attention to these things. So if that crooked tree in the swamp shows how radiation predated Chernobyl, these forest fires show how radiation long continued, Chernobyl radiation long continued after the event of 1986. And it was this ongoing quality that plagued Soviet leaders. As much as they tried, they could not close the chapter on Chernobyl. In 1990, admitting that the biological load was too much, leaders in Ukraine and Belarus announced plans to resettle 200,000 more people from the areas around the Chernobyl zone to safety. But before that could happen, the Soviet Union ended, and there was no longer any money for Plutonium. Instead, UN consultants came in and they took over managing the assessments of the thing. And they said, listen, we've taken measurements and we find that, compared to Hiroshima, radiation levels are too low here. And there's no need to move in. At the same time, the UN was raising $1 billion in today's funds to do long-term health studies on the level of Hiroshima studies, but to measure health effects with the opposite of Chernobyl events, which is the opposite of Hiroshima events, which is like one big X-ray, where Chernobyl is long-term chronic exposures to low doses of radiation. We don't have any really studies that talk about human exposures to low doses of radiation. So they were going to do that. There's a marvelous opportunity to study that. But that study didn't get off the ground because, again, the UN consultants said, there's no reason for a study. We don't think you'll find any health effects if you do a study. That would be a big waste of money. And so that pledge drive only raised about $6 million instead of and neither the movement of people or the health study. As opposed to Soviet crisis deepened, subsidies for clean food and medical monitoring in contaminated areas withered. The new neoliberal orientation of Ukraine and Belarus in the later 90s made it easier ideologically to abandon people to continue to ground. And I think we see this globally. As more and more people live in environments saturated with toxins, we find that risk has been privatized. So I think the constriction of the social welfare state and the planet in a state of ecological stress is a correlation. Whether there's causation between those two things, I think is something that we humanists should not leave alone to politicians and scientists. I think we should wait and look. So as commentators in the West announced the end of history in the 1990s, people on Chernobyl contaminated ground were left to carry on alone. They ate what they produced, having few other options. There were few doctors to monitor because the medical personnel were the first to leave these areas. In one of the few studies of Chernobyl birth defects, Vladimir Verlecki in that Rivne area near the Almani swamp found 6 times higher rates of a birth defect called neurotube disorders that creates spina bifida and encephaly. 6 times higher in this Rivne area than the European norm. We also found that the women who gave birth to these babies had elevated levels of symptom. Now, the jump in birth defects could be from Chernobyl, or could be from Chernobyl radiation and pre-Chernobyl radiation. It could be from radioactivity working with chemical fertilizers and nitrates in these rural farming areas. My tour through the Plutopia marshes showed that the areas that these scientists work in, their living laboratories, are charred remnants pitted with the deposits of spent ammunition, heavy metals, chemical toxins, and radioactive waste sent out at a furious pace in the second half of the 20th. Now, you might respond to this information feeling empathy for those people out there, those people in Ukraine and Belarus. And that's the way I was taught to think about history, as something that plays out nationally. But I think one of our awareness of the planetary scale of human actions leads us to understand now that those events out there make it home to us. I'll give you one last example of what I mean by that. As I traveled around the summers when I was researching this book in northern Ukraine and southern Belarus, I found thousands of people going into the forest to pick wild organic blueberries from the summer. And they came out, this is on an industrial scale. They would sell, they'd be met by buyers on the road, these horses, so you buy right from the pickers. And the buyers told me they bought like about 2 tons a day up there. So my research assistant and I, William Martin, we decided we would go undercover berry picking ourselves. And here I am, I've just sold my berries happily to the buyers. And then we followed the buyers to the warehouse where they were resold again to the distributor. And this nice lady here was buying the berries, but before she bought the berries, she first measured them. I said, how many of these berries are radioactive? She said, all the berries are radioactive, but some are really radioactive, like 3,000 becquerels a kilogram. Now, the Ukrainian threshold at that time was 450 becquerels a kilogram. So when we stood around and watched her, she put the dirtier berries over there and the cleaner berries over there, but she bought all the berries. So I asked, she didn't give me an answer, but the pickers told me that it's like this once. You mix the dirtier ones with the cleaner ones and you get to the European norm, 1,250 becquerels per kilogram, and then they can go over the border into the EU. So now these berries are getting a little bit closer to our European southern. But then I was checking the Homeland Security records, and I noticed that there was a big truck going over the border from Canada into the United States with a radiated mass inside. Did some more research, called up the guy, he goes, yeah, those are berries from Ukraine. I said, what did you do with them? I said, well, they were within the American norm, 1,250 becquerels a kilogram, so I let it go through. So when you ask a specialist in health physics about those berries, and he is almost always he would say, nothing to worry about. We all have radioactivity. And I think that point underlines what I found, that Chernobyl accident serves only as an exclamation point in the chain of toxic exposure that remaster landscapes and societies and bodies, including our own bodies. Describing Chernobyl as an accident is like a broom that sweeps away the larger story that's so important. I think one reason I found so little research other than thyroid cancer about the Chernobyl health effects is that scientists have thrown up their hands at the toxic complexity of these layered landscapes. The other reason for the paucity of research I found working my way through 5 UN archives is that UN agents work to cover up the story of a public health disaster. I found them hiding biopsies, burying data, slandering and discrediting and trying to fire opposing scientists. Then you might ask, why would UN officials do that? What's in it for them? But I found that UN officials serve their client states, and big client states are also the big player states. United States, France, Great Britain, Russia, and China. Now, these countries were in the 1990s on the line for billions of dollars in liability. As the Cold War records opened, people found out that they had been exposed in nuclear testing and the production of nuclear weapons to a great deal of harm. Now, if you could instrumentalize Chernobyl, world's worst, humanity's worst nuclear accident, and only 33 people died. We can live with that kind of risk. Then those liabilities, the cost of cleanup, all that could go away. That's indeed what happened. And this is where the accident narrative was useful. In Chernobyl, the one-off disaster, and these liabilities go away. It's a different story to see Chernobyl as an acceleration in a century in which the U.S. and the United States alone released not 45 million curies of radioactive iodine, and radioactive iodine goes to thyroid, causes thyroid cancer, and a host of other health problems. But just at the Nevada test site alone, a whole other order of magnitude, about 150 billion curies. Now, most countries tested nuclear bombs in so-called space. The Brits went to Australia and the South Pacific, the French went to the South Pacific and Nigeria, the Soviets went to Kazakhstan, the Soviets went down north. But the Americans opened a test site in the country. And here's a dose reconstruction map of radioactive iodine. Nevada, hotspots in Nevada, but also throughout the Southwest. But then you see that the radiation went up sky high, it went north of the trade winds and started going east. Hotspots, just the tropic as ground zero, right in our corn belt. Iowa, Minnesota. Over there in upstate New York were Kodaks. So I think, they didn't have so much information, they weren't really monitoring this, but Kodak was monitoring because the film would get messed up every time there was one. They're pretty good monitors. You see down there in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, you also see monitoring. So I think this could be a more densely populated town. So here again, scale confounds the issue. Global fallout spread after 1951, mostly in the northern hemisphere. In the same decade, rates of cancers, especially childhood cancers that used to be a medical rarity, started to increase as well in the northern hemisphere. So too did birth defects and fertility problems. Thyroid and pediatric cancers continue to grow, and so do cancers of people born after 1950. Male sperm counts in the northern hemisphere after 1945 have dropped. Now, these diminished human health indicators also became a new background against which Chernobyl health assessments were made. Scientists call this a shifting background syndrome. In other words, the scale of possible damage from global testing that released at least 200 billion curies of radioactive iodine alone is too oversized for us. It is a huge fact, saturating our data. Well, I'll leave you with one last photo. It's this girl with blue lips. I took a picture of her. She's a picker. And she's a kid, but she eats some berries and she puts some. But I hope you also see how she's also been there to clean up the toxic detritus left for her, like others. But maybe the problem is not available. Those berries and then the mushrooms that come back later to pick in the fall are doing the work of what an army of scientists could not manage to do. They're cleaning up radioactive contaminants. If we could think of this more creatively, pay this girl $25 a day, something she needs to do to make a living, and then take those berries and mushrooms and deposit them as radioactive waste, then we can start to see another world. You could invite in the disaster tourists that love to go to the Chernobyl zone, and they could take a tour picking radioactive berries. They could take a picture of a selfie of them eating a radioactive berry, and then they could bury it as radioactive waste and pay that girl $25 a day. What I'm trying to say is if we look at these problems with our eyes wide open, suddenly we can come up with solutions. And then I think we have a brave new world. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take questions.
This is just a really obvious question, but I'm just kind of curious, since the book has been out for a while, if you could tell us a bit about the reception of it.
On the day it was published, the Journal of Radiological Protection published a review of my book. Look at that, an academic journal releasing a book review on the day of the publication. Have you ever heard of that? I had never heard of it. So there we are, and it was a 12-page ad hominem attack by a guy who appears in my book. He's the guy who says nature is driving the Chernobyl zone, Jim Smith, a British scientist. And he just went on and on, keep around so wrong about this and And I figured, okay, fine, 35 people who read the Journal of Radiological Protection, don't worry. But then this other guy, Michael Schellenberger, who runs not one, but two environmental protection nonprofits funded by the Pittsburghs, big into oil and gas. And he picked it up and retweeted it. He has tens of thousands of followers. And his nonprofits are proven here. And he also has a column in Forbes, so he tried to do this all on Forbes. And so all of a sudden, my agent's calling me and saying, you've got to do something about this. But meanwhile, my editor said, and then, there was a letter going to the president of MIT suggesting that I be fired. The nuclear engineering department at MIT also suggested that I should be fired, and stuff like that. So here I am. I'm suddenly like a character in my own book. I'm getting the same treatment as these, maverick scientists, the rogue scientists who didn't agree with the standard UN opinion. And I didn't want to be a character in my own book, right? So I didn't know what to do. For a while, I didn't do anything. And then I finally realized that, what do I have? I'm armed with all this information. And so I went point by point and answered Jim Smith's, critiques. And it was really easy, to take it apart. I had all the, I could say, and look at this report, look at this study. And so I did that. I had to do that on Twitter, and then they sort of went away. It took me a lawyer and 2 years to get the Journal of Radiological Protection. That's so quick on reviews to publish an answer, my letter, responding to that review. I mean, really amazing. The lawyer was actually saying, this journal should have its status, and I'm saying this in public, this journal should have its status as a nonprofit objective journal taken, right? It's tax-free status taken. So that's the kind of reception I got. For the most part, was this sort of attack from industry scientists. I was, I sort of expected, but I thought I would get more attacks from people who I basically call perpetrators in the book, and I made a decision to name them. The guy who hides the biopsy, the guy who's trying to fire the dissenting scientists, that kind of stuff. And I thought they would come at it, but they didn't. They didn't. And I've been pretty careful to make sure I had the and it's really destructive. Yeah.
If nobody minds, I'd like to ask two questions. First question is just about the timing of the idea that the nuclear establishment conceals this. Thanks to 3 Mile Island, the nuclear establishment, especially in the US, is already, in the doldrums. We know that lots of projects were mothballed well before Chernobyl. And also in Chernobyl, at this moment, the wise men like Paul Kennedy are saying the Soviet Union's going to last forever. So there's no sense that post-Cold War liabilities loom on the horizon. So I'm just wondering about how you think about that particular time span this occurs in, and what sounds like a cover-up. And my second question is, you very interestingly frame this via the acceleration. You, of course, have your own way of this, but I couldn't help thinking of the great acceleration and the timing matching on. So I just wondered how you see this mapping onto, the surge in wealth, but also in life expectancy across much of the world that occurs over this time period too.
Yeah. So I was thinking of John Neal's use of the great acceleration. And, I just came from a meeting at the Anthropocene Working Group, and, they're looking through the geological record to see markers for the Anthropocene. And it just over and over again, 1950, no matter what strategic point that they're looking at around the world, the strongest signal they get is man-made radioactivity. That's very much, and it just sends out this blinking signal that's part of the. Remind me of your first question.
It was just the timing issue.
Oh, the timing.
So in 86.
Yeah. So in 1987, the Association of American Health Physicists, these are the people who make pronouncements on health and radiation, they had their annual meeting in Columbia, Maryland. And at that meeting, the keynote speaker was a lawyer from the Department of Department of Energy. And he said, the biggest threat to the future of nuclear power is not another accident like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl last year, but lawsuits. And so what we're going to do is we're going to break out those. So all of you here, all of you health physicists in the United States can serve as credible government witnesses. And you break out rooms, these Department of Justice lawyers are going to school you so you can be objective witnesses on behalf of the US government. So that's how anxious they were year after Chernobyl, about Chernobyl. The IEA is holding meetings this summer after the accident saying, there's 3 Mile Island, now there's Chernobyl. We're really worried about the future of nuclear energy. So, this was an immediate response, that we need to sort of mobilize. And you see, like at first, you see all these American commentators saying, yeah, the Soviets are terrible. Yeah, that's a terrible disaster. There's 2,000, already there are 2,000 victims. They say, like, 2 days after the accident, they learned the accident. They quickly downgrade that. Because they start to say, oh my God, if we do our usual thing and blow up a Soviet accident to this nth degree, we're going to make all of nuclear power look bad. So there's a real anxiety that comes up, and the first sort of real suggestion of lawsuits and request for the environmental record occurs. The DoD, the Department of Energy, releases about 10,000 pages of documents right in March of 1986 around the Hanford site, hoping that the protesters who were banging on the gates would just go away when they had all this technical information. So it's all happening around the same time. Norma.
Okay. A couple of things. One is, since I noticed that in the tests in the Pripyat marshes, where at least some of them were tactical nuclear weapons, right? And I was thinking just at that very same time, since we are at the University of Chicago, as part of civil defense, the U of C conducted tests on 102 of its students and staff between 61 and 63. and they fed them actual fallout from the Nevada test site or simulated fallout to see how it would go through the body. So this is talking about ingestion. This is a congressional report, so anyone can find it online, 1986, and Markey was the chair, now the senator from Massachusetts. And I just recently noticed that the test, which was called the small boy shot, was also a tactical weapon. And so, it was very same, and you've written so much and so compellingly about the similarities and parallels between the US and the Soviet Union. And I was just thinking, here's another one, and I'm wondering if we can see that region which you showed on the map, the Nevada test site and on, as a kind of, an acceleration in a very different ecosystem, but certainly that part of the American West went that way. The question I wanted to ask you was, I'm also really interested, I would love to find alums from that period of the college or medical school and compare them to the American soldiers who were compelled to watch these tests, as was common. Anyhow, I'm suspecting the U of C grads might have access to better health care than the veterans, but who knows. Anyhow, there's when you open this book, you talk about how we don't want to be caught in the perpetual loop, repeating the same thing. And it's a really mournful experience for me to reread your book after the 10th anniversary of Fukushima, because it's an acceleration and sophistication of denial that in fact is happening. And so that if pediatric thyroid cancer was the only one the officialdom acknowledged as an impact of Chernobyl, Japanese authorities are doing everything they can to deny even pediatric thyroid cancer. But even more, it's people themselves censoring them. So it's like a great silence has become in Japan, and people censor themselves and monitor each other. And I wonder if you saw any of that in the decades following the fall of the Soviet Union and the neoliberal regime, that people really avoid talking about it, don't welcome others bringing it up. And what do people do?
I don't know about like a decade after 1996. That's when that big thyroid controversy was coming out, and finally in 1996, there is a big bump in pediatric thyroid cancer. The UN was forced to admit it after they denied it as well. But one of the things I did is thousands of people were writing letters in 1986, and saying, you may not know, but in our community, we have a lot of radiation. And we're sort of okay most of the time, but right here in the schoolyard, there's an awful lot of radiation, and our kids play there. And so usually people had really good, these are just simple villagers, right? But they had good solutions. Like, so could you put asphalt down in the dirt, and that would hold down the radioactivity? Or our town's kind of okay, we didn't get any fallout clouds, but the trucks come right through from the Chernobyl zone, and their dust they bring has left this big radioactive trace. So could you build a bypass around our town? So all these people had they knew what was going on in the community. They clearly made alliances, sort of illegally, with radiation monitors and local doctors and nurses, and found out what they could and pieced together the story on the ground for them. Really different from the parachuting scientists who drop in, take some measurements, and go away. You don't know who's sick, who's what, where the water flows. Like the workers in the wool factory. And so what we did is we found as many people we could who wrote these letters, and found them 30 years later. And it was so apparent in the 1980s that all anybody could talk about was Chernobyl. Going back 30 years later, that's the last thing they wanted. Oh, not Chernobyl again. And part of it was we're stigmatized as Chernobyl people. You guys just come here, all you want, especially Westerners, all you want is Chernobyl. And we had this conversation with one woman, and she's like, we don't have Chernobyl around here. There's no Chernobyl. Stop asking these kinds of questions. And then we just stood there, and then she started talking about the 2 women's cancers she had had, and the heart attack she had in 45 years of age. And we just stood there, we didn't really know how to respond to that. And then she goes, okay, maybe there is Chernobyl, but it's our Chernobyl. I thought that was really telling. That this tragedy brings all these outsiders like me who come in to make pronouncements on who they are, what the community is about, and what the results are. Nobody's really asking them. And they're the experts in survival. I was really over and over again struck by the nuanced knowledge people have about the really technical and complicated environments and this issue that we do with physics and evolution.
So I have some questions from Zoom. There's about 3. Can I just give you all 3? And I can repeat them if you need.
You do one at a time.
I'll do one at a time. So the first one is, could you tell us a little more about how you think we should approach the problem of telling history on a planetary scale?
That's a great question. And I've been boiled up in that for the last few years. Because I think it is, obviously we're caught in this sort of elaborated catastrophe. And I felt for a long time a sense of responsibility to try to get my fellow citizens, my fellow planetarians to think about it in certain ways and to be alert, to be aware of it. Now that I've written 4 books that are deeply depressing, I'm starting to think otherwise, that maybe I should be writing books that are more hopeful, books that sort of point towards possible solutions in lowercase letters, solutions that people like ourselves, right here in our immediate environment, can deploy, so that on a personal level we feel less anxious. And on a larger level, we feel like we're contributing to a sustainability of this precarious world that we face.
Let's see. The next one was, have you written about the backlash you experienced after your publication of the Chernobyl book?
I think I published that somewhere, I can't remember where.
Okay. And this is perhaps a third one, kind of goes back, I think, to a little bit of what you were just talking about. And it's in your research, as you look through historical records or do in-person field work at these locations, what challenges have you faced in terms of access, secrecy, and restriction to these sites, and how have you navigated these boundaries? How, as a scholar, have you worked through the difficulty of entering these physical and/or temporal spaces of exclusion?
It wasn't that hard to get into the Chernobyl zone, mostly because, obviously, tourists go, anybody wants to chunk out some money can go, but I was just written on the note that the path that the biologists had just wrote into their project. So that was, like getting permission there, wandering around there was not very difficult. Once you're there, there's a bunch of rules you just have to abide by them. And the will of the biologists are following. But so that didn't feel difficult. The one part of this story that I did not cover was in Western Russia, because I started this project in 2014, right when the war broke out between Russia and Ukraine, and that border became a war zone, and I couldn't cross it. I mean, I could cross it by flying to Moscow and taking the train over. But as I contacted people in Western Belarus, the response I got a couple of times, and that's all I needed, was, why would I give any aid to an American fifth columnist? And these were among people who were sort of scientists who were looking at effects of Chernobyl radiation environment, etc. So I just skipped, maybe that's somewhat lame, but I just didn't incorporate that territory of Western Belarus.
There's at least one more question from Zoom, but if there are other questions in the room, maybe first. Right. So the last question I have from Zoom, at least at the moment, is have you looked into the Dyatlov Pass incident in 1959, or have you heard about the radioactive contamination caused by the military in the Northern Urals in the Sverdlovsk Oblast, the clothing found on several hikers' bodies had beta contamination well above explainable background levels. So it was something similar to what you described in Pripyat marshes before Chernobyl happening there too.
In Sverdlovsk, I don't know about the Sverdlovsk, the first give a year?
1959.
1959. Yeah, that was not so far, about 100 miles from Sverdlovsk was a big mayak plant where they were making plutonium. And it had a lot of emission, just a colossal amount of emission. 1957 was a big accident, and it left a contaminated trails. So depending on where the hikers were, they might have, hiked through parts of that trace or parts of the trace that weren't officially categorized. So that I would suspect that probably had something to do either with that or the testing that was going down in the southern Urals. So Mayak testing. And the other question about Diablo Canyon, I've only looked into that, there's been some recent forest fires out there that have done the same thing as those forest fires I described in Chernobyl's only volatized radioactive dose or any plant like leaf litter, this shrub bush that was in that area. And it's pretty serious. Depending on who you ask, it's pretty serious in all that smoke that was coming out. So.
A more general question. Maybe talk a little bit about what the process has been for you as a historian, trained as a social science humanities scholar, to think about text and interpret text, right? To shift to thinking about these forms of knowledge that you were not initially trained to sort of encounter as primary objects, right? And working with other experts, scientists, and sort of sorting through that, those different forms of knowledge, as, I don't know, second order observer or someone alongside these other, sort of how do you think about those kinds of issues of?
Yeah, methodology,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, no, I started to sort of do that kind of, when I started working on Plutopia, I was initially just interested in the creation of nuclear security state. And I noticed that these, where they made bombs, they made these new human configurations, which was a closed nuclear state. And I thought, these are the founding fathers and mothers of the nuclear security state that we all live in now. We're all like happily getting away of record information, going through, scanners and having our mail read. That's our normal existence. So that's what I thought that book was going to be about. But as I read my way through archives and talked to people, I realized that I needed to know a lot more about engineering. And I lived in Washington, D.C. at the time, and one of the engineers and physicists at my university had grown up in Richmond. And he said, I'll collaborate with you, So he helped me, he and I read through these documents that I got. And he started out, it was interesting to watch him, and that sort of helped me monitor whether my assessments are right. He started out as this patriotic American, and we saved American lives by dropping that bomb. It was a great thing. It was a great feat that my father had been a part of. By the end of that research project, he had gone 180 degrees, and he sounded like late night conspiracy radio. He was really like shocked by what we were talking about. Okay, so that, and I would say, so what do you make of this? And he would, break it down and explain it for me. And so and then I knew some friends who worked at NIH as statisticians, and that helped me, because I didn't even know about statistics, and here I am, we talked about statistics, reading these statistics and trying to make sense of them. And they helped me work through that. And so I realized that was a great model for some things. We can't be expected to know all of this, but we can make alliances with people who can help us. We don't have the other skills that we have about assessing text and writing them up in the narrative format and breaking them down to a point. And so I applied that to this Chernobyl story. And so I worked with Valentina Drost, who was this endocrinologist who worked with thyroid issues and biologists. I worked with some other radiation monitors. We go out and we look at the landscape and measure. And it really, I mean, it was amazing how like the light would start to come on. Like that experience where I saw a twisted pine tree. I was like, but that's not right. I know that's not right because I learned that from my biologist friend. You know, and I would be in a village and somebody would, you know, start talking and they'd talk about their health problems and their children and their, you know, husband, you know, and they'd attribute all to Chernobyl rather indiscriminately in my mind. And I you know, didn't know what to do with this. It seems quite anecdotal. But then I would turn and, you know, over the shoulder, the person was, I remember seeing this forest that was, you know, the forest was like southeast corner, you know, where the winds come from, Chernobyl. And I could see on the edge of the forest these pine trees, and I could see the sort of like the handprint of the Chernobyl clouds in the distortions of the edge of the forest. I thought, maybe this woman isn't just making this up. Maybe I should go check the record and when this came from there, what it was. And so I did, and then, you know, so that being able to read the landscape like a text helped me as I sort of crossed it. Human narrative, oral history, whatever you make of that. There's some things we see strange in the environment, and there's some numbers that some monitors took. So by triangulating that, I could start to get a story that I believe there might be something. Yeah. So.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I was really struck by this phrase that you used, that nature doesn't lie, which seemed to also be in
Trees don't lie.
Trees don't lie. Yeah, which would seem to be in tension with something you were discussing later, that someone you talked to described it as our Chernobyl. So I was wondering if you could work out or invite you to say something about the tension between these two archival materials, and maybe even you seem to be using people's bodies in some ways as an archive to write about to write these histories. So I was wondering if you could work out and discuss some of the ethical and political stakes of doing history like this.
Yeah. So can you tell me more about the tension you see between our Chernobyl and Chernobyl?
In some sense, it seemed to me that the nature seemed to be presenting this almost objective fact of what seemed to have happened, whereas the our Chernobyl and the stories seem to be a more ambivalent and more less, in some sense, just about the radiation. It's more affective in some way.
Yeah. No, I think you're right that you're pointing, and of course, whether trees lie or don't, trees don't care about that. And people who talk about trees can lie about that. You can be wrong. You know, not trying to argue, you can be wrong. And that science changes over time. And we've seen that, especially recently, and we've seen it before. So that's a little bit off the cuff. Thank you for touching. But I do think that the environment offers what geologists call really fascinating. That geologists will just be like a text, and they do what historians do. They the 2 inches down is around about 1950, and 4 inches down is 1900. So they're putting together evidence in time. And so one thing I wish I'd done was, and I didn't think of this until I finished, I started getting more interested in microbiome. And I wish I had gone and found old outhouses and gotten core sample. And then I would have had, especially that boggy and pretty well frozen sort of microbial samples, and you could see if the microbes themselves showed distortion or changes in the food. And so that would have been a way to use bodies as archives without having to dig into bodies with all those technical. So that even landscapes themselves can tell us about what we're most interested in, which is often human life. I was, in terms of talking about people and their health issues, that was tricky. And I did publish the name of one young woman who gave the interview with me who had thyroid cancer as a child, and I was trying to actually, I think successfully, having checked herself at the time to do that. And I gave her real name, and one of the Belarusian doctors I worked with said, how is her real name? I said, well, she gave me an interview and didn't say this was off the record or change her name. But in Belarus, to be somebody who has cancer is still stigmatized. And so I sort of lumped right into that and passed on the Ukrainian transition. So it's tricky work, and I often, I often felt like a disaster tourist asking, so tell me more about your other pets. This gentleman here.
With respect to your last sentence, just learn about the impulse or impulses behind disaster tourism.
I'm sorry,
What did you learn about the impulse or impulses behind disaster tourism?
it's an amazing phenomenon. There's stag parties go to the zone, and the young men, about to reproduce, they're going to the Chernobyl zone. A lot of, there's more men there as tourists than women. They tend to skew young, in their 20s. I know, there's one of the bigger online shooting games is called Stalker, and it takes place in radioactive zones, the first of which was the Chernobyl zone. And I think people play that and feel like they're, virtually having this incredible Chernobyl experience, and then they want to go themselves and see the video. So I think there's that, and there's often every couple of months in the Ukrainian press, you see this news story about stalkers who would climb over the fence, they gear themselves up, Geiger counters and water and all this stuff, and they climb over the fence and then go into the Chernobyl zone and stalk, like the movie goes stalker. And then they get caught by the police. So I think there's that, but I also think it does relate to what we were talking about with this planetary crisis, is that more and more people are fascinated by the ruins that the militaries, since the beginning of the 1950s, where all these great accelerations occurred, that is, we've had the accelerated pace of abandonment material. And so, in some ways, if you can go and see one of those sites and visit a whole city abandoned, you get a sense of maybe what our future might be. I think that it's really just futuristic.
Yeah, perfect. Lead into the question I wanted to ask, which is about kind of long-term nuclear storage. It's not a discussion around how do signpost sites like the vault proposed in Nevada for long-term storage and communicate to people far, far off in the future. But kind of one of the things I'm taking away from the talk is that probably we're better at thinking about the future, people far in the future than we are about how we memorialize nuclear disasters or security factors. So do you think that these kinds of discussions about long-term storage can be a distraction from some of these contemporary issues around how we live with nuclear contamination?
I think we need long-term storage for all everything. And how to signpost it, that's a famous project. But, the waste storage problem is huge. Right now, when they decommission a reactor in the United States and most parts of the world, the only place to store it, and we know it's a human disaster, is right where the nuclear power plant is. The nuclear power plants and shorelines, coastal areas. What are we seeing? More and more storage, more and more flooding. And that's the only place that, and these nuclear power plants tend to be near populated areas. So we need to figure out the long-term storage. Not just the language about how we talk about in signposts, but really like how. So that's the future.
Hardly, sorry. I want to go back to your question about trees don't lie versus the women saying it's our Chernobyl. And I wonder if there isn't another dimension to that, which is that it's the Hiroshima Nagasaki lifespan study, which is called still the gold standard. And so much of that has, and the Nevada test site, has governed who gets to be recognized as a radiation victim around the world. And it's all about dose reconstruction. It's almost never, I mean, in the West, has not been about looking at bodies. And so that, and there's a slight shift in some ways, but in your book, you talk a lot about what the Soviet doctors did because they didn't have access to it. Whereas with 3 Mile Island or so many other nuclear disasters, so many people have never had their lifetime of illness recognized because it's all about computational modeling. And no, you didn't get enough dose, so it can't be it. At times I wondered, what's the point of this touted science that throws up its hand before so many suffering people? We can't explain what's wrong with you, but we know it's not whatever you've been exposed to. So the tree being there, I think, is a useful marker of that.
Yeah. But another researcher told me how she was looking at forestry records, and they were doing some study on certain kind of beetles that commercial high trees. And Soviets were in this international project, but they would not share their wood. They wouldn't share the actual wood core samples because they not only talked about this light, this past, but they also would show the levels of radioactivity. And so the trees were unable to lie. And so we had that sort of fascinating ways. And what Norm was referring to in terms of the Soviet doctors, did not have access to radiation numbers. That was a classified, long-standing practice when the first exposed people in the late 1940s in the Soviet Union. That the doctors were sort of working blindly. They had somebody they knew had been exposed to radiation, but how much? And so the American doctors would have had some numbers. So the Soviet doctors learned to read bodies and use bodies like Geiger counter. And see changes in cell structure and chromosome breakages and neurological transformation, and then say, well, that must have been a dose of that. And they got so good at seeing radiation bodies, that they sort of didn't need the Geiger counter. That, I think, far superior science than health physics in the West was tossed out as one of the casualties of the end of the war. It was like, oh, these Soviets don't know what they're doing. Like, the DOE goes in and supports all these nuclear laboratories and nuclear establishments in the former Soviet Union. And they go, no, that's all right. We're funding that, but let's just do it. And so the last time they sort of gave it a diagnosis of like chronic radiation, so doing it from 2014. And that's sort of the death now. Pretty good Soviet science.
We do have a couple more questions from Zoom, if you're up for a couple more. The first one is, one of my favorite chapters of the book was about a woman named Talia, the Swamp Dwellers chapter. Can you talk a little bit more about how the stories of individuals helped animate the story you were trying to tell, even if it's a story with a global or planetary stakes?
So that chapter on about Talia was a 97-year-old woman writing about it. She told me her own story. And then I went back the next summer and she told me the exact same story again. And that third time, when I'm hearing the third time the same story, I sort of start to levitate in my imagination. And I start to see her in the chapter. She's just going, she's this amazing woman who's lived in this place everything the 20th century had to throw at in terms of violence and destruction was there. She's at the epicenter. War and revolution and genocide and famine and nuclear apocalypse. And she lived through it all. She's one of the few survivors who's still standing there in this abandoned village. And And the way she tells her story, she's just going from her house to the garden, her house to the river, to the forest for herbs and mushrooms, back to the village market. And she's just doing this, and all around her the landscape. And the tanks come in, and the tanks go out, and the tanks come back retrofitted as bulldozers, and they, and off we go. And I wanted to try that. I was thinking about how we use time in history. And the way we peg things in chronological order is actually a really conservative and regressive move. It implies a certain remediation and a certain progress that isn't necessarily there. But as we sort of march in time, implying problem solved. And so I wanted to, we know time doesn't work this way, so why do we write as if time works in terms of hours and years and decades? And so what I was trying to do in that chapter was to write something where time is expanding and contracting. And I don't know if it was successful, but that was the sort of crystallization of that chapter. And nobody's ever commented on it. I always thought I was going to get a lot of comments about there's this wacky moment in this book, but no. So thank you for the listening for noting that the role people play in this. So you're going through the archives and it's numbers and technical data, and lots of things are being counted. Including bodies, but it's really once people start telling stories that I at least began to understand what these invisible pulses of decaying creation mean, what these numbers mean. It's through these people, and I set out to try to focus on people who I found who lived in this place who would still be there, were experts in survival. And I thought in that sense when I started this book that we all would need to become. So that's another reason why I'm teaching. And also there's just these amazing everyday heroes, just people who took responsibility for these problems, but armed themselves with information the best way they could. Made alliances with people and stood strong and said, no, I will not sign this form that says the radiation levels are okay in this drinking water. Absolutely not. Fire me if you want. Sure enough, they fired him, but he did it. And I think we need to hear those stories.
The last question I have from Zoom is, how are you thinking about internal exposure?
Well, that's the whole thing. The Chernobyl exposures were mostly internal exposure. Meanwhile, the consultants from the West, they come with the diagram and say, the gamma rays coming here are so minimal, it's really no problem to live here. And then they do some sort of, computer simulation of what the dose might be from eating things, and, but they tend to be way underestimated what people are ingesting and what the damage is internally, partly because those studies haven't been done. But what happens when people breathe dusty air or eat food that's contaminated with radioactivity is that some of that goes back out of your body in the waste streams, but a good portion of it lands in these radioactive isotopes act as mimics of biomimics. So they mimic nutrients and minerals that our bodies are interested in. The radioactive iodine goes to the thyroid, plutonium goes to the bone marrow, strontium goes to the flesh, etc. And so then they start to decay. And there's nothing to stop the alpha and the beta from doing inside.
I was just wondering if you had ever thought that maybe the response you got from the review that came out for the year was something like that, not Chernobyl phenomenon, but as a kind of protective, there's this outsider kind of traversing into this territory where if you live there, it's kind of your dark experience. If you're a scientist, then you have another kind of dark experience in that realm, and just what it was like to kind of, was there any correlation between the way you had to respond to the science, or the scientists rather, in review, to the way you kind of had to think through?
Yeah, I think that's a really astute point. It's exactly what that science says. What a shit. Just listen to the story. This is a job for science. And the thing you most took offense at is that, I was following these biologists who say that Chernobyl, nature of Chernobyl is suffering, and he says it's thriving. So I wrote him and I said, I'd love to follow him too, but it's his own. And he wrote me back and said, I don't have any plans to follow him. I have some research assistants there who send me the data I need, and they're happy to contact them. So I reported that in the book, and he took offense, thinking that I meant to say, which I didn't, that he never mentioned Chernobyl, and that he was like some fraud. What the point I was trying to make is, as opposed to biologists who have to survey the ground, the honest field ground, as a physicist, all he needed was a number. And he could run his computations anywhere from any computer, anywhere. He didn't need to leave England to do his work on Chernobyl. And that's what I was trying to point out, that that's the kind of difference in the two kinds of way physicists approach the contaminated terrain problem and the way biologists approach it. And so, it was that thing, like, that that somehow he's not authentic. It was really complicated. That's watched. He's a pretty, he attacks everybody who disagrees with the field anyway. But he really discredited himself because he started to make atomic vodka and sell it. He grew a field of rye in Chernobyl zone. Sold $100,000 for a charity. But with that point, like, this is, there's some radiation in here, but it's clean enough for you to drink. And I don't think sales are
Thank you so much.
Thank you.